welcome. If you haven't been to one of our events before, it's very nice to have you here, and welcome back if you've been many times. It's lovely to see you again. So we are the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG. Shelley and I co-convene, and we have monthly events which we call Weekday Night Bites, which is why you are here. Tonight's event, which is No Safe Space, Places and Spaces of Horror Cinema. We've got a fantastic panel lined up with many speakers, but I'm going to introduce our chair and let her introduce those speakers. So Dr. Christina Brennan. Hi, Christina. Christina is an independent scholar and a film journalist with interests in horror cinema. Her first book is a Devil's Advocate series book on The Vanishing, the good one, not the bad remake. And she has written extensively about film, including Film Stories, Film Hounds, and Little White Lies magazine. I'm going to hand over to Christina. I'm really looking forward to this chat, so thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Thanks for that introduction. So good evening to everyone, and I think morning and afternoon, since we are have an international audience here tonight. And welcome to today's event on places and spaces of horror cinema. So to give you a bit of context, this event was born out of the shared interests of a group of interested writers, scholars, critics, working in different areas of horror cinema. And the majority of speakers tonight are very recent authors who have contributed to the Devil's Advocates book series. For those of you who aren't familiar, Devil's Advocates is an imprint that is part of Liverpool University Press, and it's dedicated to producing kind of short, accessible books about cult and classic horror cinema. So they're really smart, passionate deep dives into iconic horror movies, films like The Thing, The Shining, and also more recent films like It Follows and Let the Right One In. And each book focuses on a single film, with authors unpacking everything from production histories to themes to reception to legacy. And some of the writers of these books are here tonight. We're really lucky to have assembled an expert panel of authors who have spent many hours researching some of the most well-known influential horror films and unpicking what makes them so potent. So we have speakers who've published on Stephen King's It, the film adaptation, on Poltergeist, and also on the more slippery psychological horrors of The Wicker Man and The Craft. And as a group of authors, we realised, despite covering different films in our books, we realised that there was a very potent thread like connecting all of our works, and that was the power of space and place to really inform and enhance horror in each of the films we were studying. And the theme of space and place is at the very heart of horror cinema, and also the heart of horror scholarship as well. Robin Wood has famously talked about space and the repressed, and about how horror films repeatedly return to spaces which we think are safe, whether that's the home, the suburb, or the small town. And horror films often reveal these sites to be really sites of unimaginable terror, dramatising the eruption of the repressed into everyday life. And we realised that horror space in horror is never just a setting. It's whether it's a haunted house or a town or an abandoned cityscape, it's a borderland where opposites collapse and things that are familiar mutate into something terrifyingly unfamiliar. And often spaces and landscapes are inscribed with dread, with decay, with the uncanny, often reflecting wider tensions in society. And also this theme of space, we realised, was at the forefront of kind of evolving questions about the genre. There's the globalization of horror and how that has changed the kind of spaces we might see on screen. And then there's also horror set in kind of more digital or virtual spaces now that are also changing our understandings of place. So we hope we may be able to delve into some of these varied themes tonight. We have a set of very interesting speakers who'll talk about some influential films that have informed the horror genre. In terms of how tonight will work, we'll start with a 10-minute introduction about the overarching role of space and place in horror. And our first speaker tonight, Dr Kev Bickerdike, will talk about space and place, specifically in British horror cinema. and he'll be talking about spatial theory in this context as well. And he's an expert in this area who will be taking us through these themes and very much setting the scene for what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the event. And then we'll launch into a series of very short talks from each of the authors here tonight, whose work really spans a wide variety of horror films and cinema. And then hopefully at the end, we'll open the floor to you. There'll hopefully be time for a Q&A to round off the session, and you can ask any questions you might have of the panel, and perhaps we can dive a little deeper into some of the ideas raised in the presentations. So I wanted to keep this introduction short and snappy so that we had time to discuss. I'm pleased to be handing over now and introducing Dr Kev Bickerdike, who'll be speaking about place and space in British cinema. So Dr Bickerdike is an independent scholar who recently completed a PhD at Sheffield Hallam, and his thesis examined the significance of space and place within British horror. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kev, who will talk us through space and place in British cinema. Over to you, Kev, when you're ready.
Yeah. So, hi everyone. So I'll basically give kind of a cursory overview of space, place and horror cinema, largely drawn from my recently completed thesis. So all narratives occur within space, but space is far more than just the site of those narrative events. And it's important to state this distinction because there's a tendency for many cinematic and literary readings to overlook space or reduce it to an incidental factor, a backdrop on which other identity influencing events occur. Where space is acknowledged, it's often subject to reductive language and descriptions that stereotype it and contribute towards its marginalisation. Phrases such as the wild space of the rural or the sprawling metropolis, statements that lack any expansion or justification. So space is deserving of more sustained study, and it is itself an intrinsic influence upon culture and identity. My own research is, as I'm sure the papers we'll hear today are, concerned not only with events that occur within particular spaces, but why they occur within those spaces. So any literature searches aimed at sourcing writing on horror and space will yield relatively few results. And a possible reason for the underutilization of spatial examinations is the fact that there is no unified strand of academic inquiry relating to space, or at least within literature and cinema studies. So, for example, whilst my own thesis was concerned entirely with spatial readings of horror films, I had to utilize a framework that was drawn from human geography, social psychology, and cultural theory. So there's no definitive area of knowledge that we can term spatial theory. And whilst you can argue that other theoretical frameworks are at least partially multidisciplinary, I think it's especially true of theories of space. As horror scholars, we need to recognise that the genre, more than any other, is ideally suited to spatial explorations, as it utilises space to generate its particular affects. Space within the genre is used to convey the emotional responses that characterise horror, such as fear, disgust and anxiety. And there are examples throughout cinema's timeline that demonstrate this. So the cabinet of Dr. Caligari makes use of angular, distorted shapes within its set design and heavily contrasted uses of shadow and light to reflect the unsettled psychological state of its narrator. The film uses its spaces to externally convey interior mood and states of mind. Dawn of the Dead utilises hordes of lumbering zombies within a post-apocalyptic shopping mall to express ideas about the stupefying effects of consumerist spaces, whilst the Blair Witch Project builds upon a tradition of films that have their protagonists venture into a variety of backwards locales that include the forest, where the comforts, the attitudes and visibility of the urban are displaced by an unforgiving and unknowable landscape. All three of these examples recognise space as being more than merely the site of their narratives, and they fully utilise the particularities of those spaces to inform characterisation and narrative, as well as using these spaces as antagonistic devices in and of themselves. So throughout my own thesis, I've referred to the idea that horror is generated within cinematic narratives through representations of spatial tension. There are two fundamental ways in which this tension is utilised. Firstly, space itself works upon the narrative participants in a way that elicits negative emotional responses. The characteristics of that space are fundamental to any resulting tension and horror. An example is the way in which the Overlook Hotel within The Shining is an oppressive narrative element and exerts a sinister influence upon the Torrance family. The space itself governs and drives forward narrative events and produces scenarios that would not occur had the protagonist not entered that space. This form of spatial tension is very well established, and to the extent that horror spaces are coded in such a way as to impart expectations on the viewer. Abandoned buildings may be haunted, rural communities may hide secretive practices, secluded roads are populated by murderous hitchhikers, and so on. However, there's a second form of spatial tension that's generated primarily through individual and group relationships within space. Often this occurs where there's a competition to assert meaning onto particular spaces. This competition can either occur between different protagonists or between protagonists and an antagonistic space. For example, The Walking Dead is largely predicated on a series of conflicts between different groups who compete for spaces that offer stability, resources, and protection from the ubiquitous zombie threat. Indeed, dystopian narratives generate a great deal of spatial tension via the change in relationships to place. Spaces that were once the centre of identity become bereft of cultural meaning due to vastly reduced populations, and spaces that have lost their ability to be safe places must be abandoned, resulting in a loss of any aspects of identity tied to those spaces. Many dystopian narratives are clearly indebted to Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, and a key way in which tension is elicited within that story and others that followed it is the way in which its protagonist clings to remembered versions of space. And there's a pronounced difference between the spatial associations Robert Neville has to pre-viral spaces and those he has with those same spaces post-virus. Essentially, there are largely subjective versions of space that exist mentally, which I describe as cognitive spaces, and largely objective spaces as found within the real world, which I call existential spaces. And tension is generated via an inability to reconcile these two forms of space. However, cognitive space does not necessarily have to take the form of previously remembered versions of space. A scenario found within the genre is one in which narrative actors have spatial expectations of particular places that are not met. Tension is generated through the disjunct between these expectations and the spatial realities encountered. This form of tension is often expressed through representations of the perceived differences between rural and urban environments. So Ben Wheatley's Sightseers and James Watkins' Eden Lake are examples of narratives in which urbanites retreat to the country in the hope of satisfying their cognitive ideas of space, only to have their expectations subverted in ways that generate significant tension. Regardless of any narrative emphasis a film demonstrates, it's always possible to tease out significant spatial readings, whether it's via the urban-rural dichotomy that's often central to folk horror narratives, the alienating qualities of the built environment, or the ways in which spaces embody the abject qualities of horrific figures. The spatial medium is the message. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kev, for that introduction to spatial theory and the some of the context behind some of the themes of place and space that we'll be discussing tonight. With that overarching foundation in mind, I'm going to be handing over to our series of speakers who are going to be diving into more detail about space and place in specific horror films. So we have a range of films being spoken about tonight, ranging from The Wicker Man to The Craft to Poltergeist. The first of our speakers is Dr. Steve A. Wiggins, who has a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. So Steve is an independent scholar and the author of Holy Horror, Nightmares with the Bible, and Sleepy Hollow as American Myth. And Steve will be speaking to us tonight about The Wicker Man. So whenever you're ready, Steve, I'll allow you to share your slides and it'll be over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I hope that's visible to everybody. In case you're wondering why an American would write a book about The Wicker Man, as Christina mentioned, I did my doctorate in Scotland, and it was nothing like The Wicker Man, obviously. I was quite enamored of the place. But when I approached the editor for the Devil's Advocate series and asked why there was no Wicker Man volume, he said that because all the pitches they had received had been treating it as folk horror, which is how I'm going to talk about it tonight. My book does not treat this as folk horror, but I'll have a word about that just before I finish here. And just as Kev was saying, the idea of place in folk horror is really crucial and foundational. As a subgenre of horror, folk horror has been around for quite a while. It's traced back to the mid part of the last century in some form or another. But really, it only started to get any kind of attention among horror scholars around about 2010. So it's only really been about 15 years that people have started to pay deliberate attention to folk horror. And some of the elements that are most crucial to understanding what makes a film folk horror are its rural setting, that is, its space. They tend not to be in urban areas, although I would argue that there are some films that take place in urban areas that really come close to this. One that I always think of in this regard is It Follows, which of course is set in Detroit, which is a fairly rundown major city in the United States. And the backgrounds that the film shows, it looks so terribly rural because of the urban blight, but most of them take place in the countryside in a rural setting. And so that is a big part of it. And also the sense of isolation. Again, an isolation in a rural space really is crucial to folk horror. And of course, the other elements that you quite often see are things to do with, say, folk religion or paganism or sacrifice that is not in the traditional, shall we say, Western Christian ideal of it. So Wicker Man really addresses space, first of all, by isolating the entire movie onto a fictional place called Summer Isle, set in the Hebrides. And so this fictional island is a place where people who live there worship the old gods and perform the old rituals. And with a ruse to draw a modern day policeman, modern day in the 1970s, policeman to the island, by the name of Sergeant Howie, they send him a letter saying that a child has been missing, has been kidnapped, he thinks, on Summer Isle. So he flies to the island by himself and is isolated in this rural setting. And for those of you who've been to the Hebrides, you know that it's pretty isolated, and that really kind of makes a big difference. By the way, the book that this was based on, titled The Ritual, set the action actually in Cornwall, I believe it was, which really kind of takes away the extreme isolation of an island where you can only arrive by boat or plane. As a matter of fact, in the movie, there is a scene where the islanders taunt Sergeant Howie by saying that he can row to the mainland if he wants to, but it'll take him a week. So it's the isolation of this island. I would also suggest that in the case of the Wicker Man, Scotland itself is an isolated location. From the point of view of a British filmmaker, Robin Hardy, the director, was English. And as I found out from my own time in the British Isles, and as you see in popular culture all the time, Scotland is kind of othered by the English. It's somewhere else. It's foreign, almost exotic, but also kind of that barbarian place where the Picts lived, and so it's quite different than the civilized English countryside. And the movie plays on that as well. But in addition to actually being a literal kind of rural setting with isolation as in a place, it also isolates and uses place in the sense of social belonging, in the social belonging in space. So, for example, Sergeant Howie is a good Christian gentleman, as the movie portrays him. He goes to church, he takes communion, all of that. But here he is among pagans with their folk religion, and they believe it seriously, and he can't accept this paganism actually takes place in modern day Britain. And of course, the element of sacrifice, which I mentioned earlier, is the part of the twist ending. Howie himself is the sacrifice. He doesn't know that. And many people actually argue The Wicker Man is not horror because up until about the last 5 minutes, it doesn't feel like horror at all. And then the last 5 minutes just really wrench you and pull you rather drastically into the horror space. And that is because of the sacrifice element in this kind of folk horror. So I think it does really belong very well into folk horror, and these elements of space all play into that. Now, I just want to say before I finish up here that there are other interpretations of The Wicker Man, and I'm simply saying this because my book does not treat The Wicker Man as folk horror. I took the interpretive approach of looking at it as holiday horror because the movie is set on May Day. As you can see from the cover photo on the slide here, the maypole plays a part of this part in the story. The whole movie is focused around May Day. So you might think of it as space in time. That is the space that I looked at. And that's the way I treat it. So it'll be a little bit, if you're returning to the book, don't be looking for folk horror there. That's not what I'm dealing with. But there are plenty of other excellent resources out there on folk horror that will discuss these elements. So I'm going to wind it up there to give other people some time to speak, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Steve, for talking about a horror film that will mean a lot to a lot of people here, I'm sure. And I really like the angle about holiday horror, and a really, really interesting take on the conventional folk horror in the film. So thank you, Steve. I'm going to be passing along to and introducing Marcus and Mark, who will be speaking about The Woman in Black. So to introduce both of our speakers, Professor Marcus Harms leads teaching enabling programs and legal history at the University of Southern Queensland, Australia. He has a long-standing interest in and love of British horror. So thank you for Mark for joining us. And Dr. Mark Fries is a lecturer and founder member of the Film and Media Department and School of Creative Industries at the Open University. His forthcoming monographs include The Woman in Black, Cybernetic Imaginations, and The Haunted Waters of British Film and Television. So I'm very interested to hear what they'll have to say about The Woman in Black. And over to you, Mark and Marcus, when you're ready.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll go first with a few introductory comments, then I'll hand over to Mark. So there she is, the woman in black herself. We are obviously not talking about the Hammer remake with Daniel Radcliffe, but the original 1989 adaptation of Susan Hill's earlier novella, her horror Edwardian sort of pastiche from the early 1980s. And I think of all the ones you're hearing about today in this session, ours stands out because, of course, it was not a cinema film, it was a television horror, and a very noteworthy one, which had a very significant impact, especially for a few notable jump scares that occurred throughout it. Our focus in it was looking at the collaboration between those three great names, Nigel Kneale, Herbert Wise, the director, and Hill herself, but above all, Nigel Kneale, whose work I'm sure is familiar to many here. And we were looking at what Nigel Kneale added as the adapter, and what he took away as the adapter as well. He took a somewhat high-handed approach, in fact, to the original novella in some of the changes that he made. And he added a lot in terms of reworking the story structure, adding a great deal of emphasis to the way that sound is a conduit of horror as well. But one thing that is common between the book and the adaptation of 1989 is the emphasis on space, because of course most of the story takes place in a very atmospheric setting, Ilmarsh House, which is an isolated, as we've heard already, how potent the isolated space is. It's an isolated house out on the marshes. It's a scene of horror. Everything that takes place that haunts people in this film is because of what has taken place in this isolated home. And what we were focused on in this book was the significance of this film as the aesthetic, in terms of the aesthetics of TV horror, the way that this may indeed be a television film with significant claims to make for its quality and for its cultural impact that transcends the idea of just being a television film. And so with those thoughts in mind, I'll hand over to my co-writer, Mark, to tell us more about the impact of location around Ilmarsh House in this film.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. So The Woman in Black is a text all about spaces, from the tidal causeway of Eelmarsh House, through the titular woman's ability to defy material space and time, to the domestic reception context of its broadcast. The intimacy of television and its domestic context can heighten the dramatic effects for horrific content that similarly haunts the spaces of its reception environment. Horror perhaps offers both an intensified and horrific intimacy on the small screen. And it's also a medium through which most horror films were seen, especially by audiences too young to view at the cinema. And it's an aesthetic of intimacy that helps illuminate the horrific potential of The Woman in Black. So Eelmarsh House itself sits upon an isle on a tidal estuary. The fact that the sea produces an island only intermittently in the film also suggests a deep destabilization of certainty that is exacerbated by the shifting fog and the unreliable sonic landscape. And all of these factors, individual or combined, produce a powerful alienation in the protagonist and the audience, an accumulation of the spaces which create horrific ambiguity. The graveyard itself is an obvious example of a place of decay that's taken on the function of death within social discourse. The Woman in Black signal this as it features not only one but two graveyards and is the space from which the woman and the haunting manifest. The graveyard by the sea is a step further. It suggests restless death, part of maritime spaces within the horror genre, which provide confusion as to recognized limits or boundaries. And if the seaside is a place of shifting space and temporality, then the coastal grave suggests that this restlessness continues after physical death. It is a place of double or hyperliminality, and a place in which McAndrew's ambiguity dominates. Slippages between stable and unstable landscapes and material and immaterial presence creates the pockets of uncertainty where horror thrives in the text. And there are important similarities between The Woman in Black and the Japanese horror Ringu, including the link between time and space. The Woman in Black is very much informed by time and tide, taking on a monstrous form. In Ringu, the individual is cursed by viewing a videotape, a similar act of looking or watching that activates the woman's curse in The Woman in Black. They have a countdown of 7 days before they are killed by Sadako. Time is marked by a claustrophobic, deathly, and inevitable, as displayed by a countdown that appears on the screen. This is at the beckoning of what is essentially a sea demon embodied as Sadako. So again, by jettisoning the possibility of Arthur's survival, Nigel Neal creates something similar here, and both deaths take on an aquatic form by the tide and the lake. So that in the end, and for Arthur's dismay, it turns out that indeed both time and tide are waiting for at least one man. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Marcus and Mark for introducing us to the televisual aesthetics and the really eerie liminal landscapes of The Woman in Black there. I really like the reference to Ringu as well, quite unexpected. So thank you very much. I'll be handing over to our next speaker, so Dr. Alissa Burger. And Alissa is an Associate Professor of English at Culver Stockton College in Canton, Missouri. She teaches and writes extensively on the work of Stephen King, with books including Teaching Stephen King, The Quest for the Dark Tower, Genre and Interconnection in the Stephen King series, and her Devil's Advocate series book on It, chapters 1 and 2. And that is what she'll be speaking to us about tonight. So whenever you're ready, Alissa, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Christina. Okay. All right, so as Christina mentioned, my Devil's Advocate contribution is on It chapters 1 and 2, which you can see here. And in these two films, space, place, and how characters navigate those places and spaces physically, emotionally, and psychologically is really central to the narrative, both in how they engage with the spaces in the present, and then also how they have to tap into their memories of the past as well. And this really connects with what Kev was saying about space as an antagonistic device. So it's not just where things happen, it has this active presence. It functions almost as a character with King's town of Derry, Maine, which is central to his literary geography throughout his work. And so you see here a picture of Derry, and it chapters 1 and 2 has a lot of these big establishing shots that show us Derry kind of looming large in this cinematic universe, in the characters' negotiation of these spaces and places. But we also get close-up shots of these winding alleys and these hidden corners, and the posters of missing children that we see papered in some of those alleys and on light posts. And so we get to know Derry both from this big macrocosmic perspective, but also in those small details. And it's not just a static place, it's an active place. And we see that interconnection with place, individuals' experiences within the place, and also the identity of Derry itself. So part of what happens with Derry is just the nature of the town. It underlies that very existence, but part of it is also grounded in the identity and the complicity of the people who live there. So there's the interconnection between place, space, and the residents of the town that's central to the narrative that's developed over both interconnected films. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting in terms of place and space in It chapters 1 and 2 is that these places, these spaces, they're under constant negotiation. We can never fix them. We can never define them. We can never kind of anchor them down into one particular realm of understanding. So there are all of these blurry lines, all of these liminal spaces between the public and the private. So there's a scene where young Ben Hanscom is in the library. And just because it's a public place and there are lots of other people there doesn't mean that he can't have this very private horror encounter that nobody else seems to see. Similarly, we have those blurring of lines between the visible and the invisible. There's a woman who's outside on her porch when Pennywise takes Georgie, and she just kind of, goes back inside. And as the members of the Losers Club especially come back to Derry in It Chapter 2, we see that similar liminality, that similar blurriness between the past and the present, who they were when they were children and who they are now, and how they construct those memories, and how the memories kind of stack up in relation to that realities. And there's a lot of dissonance, there's a lot of disconnect, and there's a lot of constant ongoing negotiation, both conscious and unconscious, that the characters have to navigate as they learn to make their way through these spaces and figure out who they are in these spaces and what they're capable of and what they are powerless against. And so there are lots of different kinds of complications and challenges in navigating these spaces. Not only can they not be defined, they can't be anchored, they can't be fixed in any kind of concrete way. There are all of these labyrinthine spaces. The sewers, you see a map of the sewer system there in that top image. Of course, have all of these twists and turns, and there are portions of the sewers that are unmapped. And so when the Losers Club members go down into the sewers, it becomes very easy to get lost. They cannot define that space. And similarly, the fun house and the mirror maze in It Chapter 2, which we see just a glimpse of on the bottom there. These are places that should be easy to map, that should be maybe not easy to find our way through, but possible to find our way through. And that's simply not the case. But even beyond these labyrinthine horror spaces, these complex spaces where we anticipate that challenge, maybe that same complication, that same challenge of navigating spaces occurs in everyday spaces as well, particularly in the homes of the members of the Losers Club. They're not safe in these, traditional horror spaces. They're not safe in their hometown, and they're not safe even in their own homes. And so it becomes a constant act of negotiation and survival. Thank you.
Thank you, Alissa. That was great. A real deep dive into a really iconic series from a really influential horror author. Going from Derry, Maine to kind of American suburbia, I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Robert Mclaughlin, who's a lecturer at Arden University. And he has a passion for all things comic book and horror related. He's written not only about Poltergeist, but also horror spaces in children's television, Doctor Who and Deadpool. He's presented papers on hauntology and the demise of VHS, long-forgotten television and B-movies. And he'll be speaking to us tonight about Poltergeist. So when you're ready, Rob, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the introduction. So hopefully we can all see Carol Ann staring out into the abyss of the film. So thank you. Yeah, so my book was about Poltergeist, and Poltergeist was released as part of the trilogy of suburban work that Spielberg produced in the early 80s, which also included Close Encounters and, of course, E.T. And the main themes of the text is really the notions of capitalism and conservatism, with this attempt by the Freelings, who are this kind of perfect American suburban family, to basically say, what can I do in this reinforcement of Ronald Reagan's free market economic model? From a political standpoint, the idea was these families are boomers. The inspiration is to basically produce and get this new beautiful house and this new beautiful space that they have. The idea of corporate profitability and irresponsibility is also this underplayed theme within the text as well. This idea that greed is good within the 80s, as it were. It's a film that really allows this exploration, the motifs of invasive fear, and this idea of the unknown, basically interjecting into this potential space that most Americans of the time would know. This normative way of life, a life defined by a sort of preset and predefined ways of living it. White, it's middle class, and it's heteronormative. It's very, very conservative. And this middle class modern living is setting within, again, apologies for my Spanish, a Cuesta Verde, a fictional estate established in Poltergeist, and was like a lot of post-war suburbs developed across America based on the New York Levittown model, which was the prototype, which was one of the first suburbs in the US, and created in Long Island in 1947, and saw a development of 2,000 homes. This initial development became the catalyst for not only the social movement, but in turn how cinema audiences perceived space and location in this context. There's become a lot of disassociation, of course, in the 70s and 80s with the archetypal horror environments of the 1930s and 40s, where audiences no longer recognize the notions of a suburban environment. And my apologies, I've gone a bit too quickly there through the slides. The suburban estates, of course, replaced Transylvanian castles, the back roads of Texas, the roadside front houses, and the purpose of these spaces were to be interchangeable environments, to become and represent anywhere USA, which is very much more closer to home than a lot of the other horror texts of Transylvania and of Hammer that, of course, was prevalent in the cinema in the 70s. Of course, this comes from this notion of the suburban horror cycle of texts, and provided horror at home, and of course is debated through John Carpenter's Halloween, which is of course this false but familiar reality created in this safe space, this human-made environment for modern suburban living that provided little in the way of natural surroundings, a place that also had no personality and indeed no charm. This idea of a sanitized and gentrified estate full of repeated houses designed in rows with a bland beige exterior repeated as an identikit. And of course, all the inhabitants within this same economic space, of course, were also from the same socio-economic groups, created a kind of cultural vacuum, but however became a perfect space and perfect place for bladed glove killers, gremlins, ghoulies, and of course the vampires next door. The houses, gardens, and fronts of the lawn of the Freelings, everywhere, is basically a suburban uncanny space. It's not really real. The idea is you're isolated within your own home. You may well acknowledge your neighbours, but indeed and live by them, but you never really know them. There's a disassociation with the geography of the space they live. Even though there's closeness and proximity, there's an emphasis within the text, of course, with this idea that everything happens behind closed doors. Within the narrative, the feelings become victims of kind of the lack of communal spirit, as a natural breakdown of societal norms happens within the text. Initially, Steve misses work due to Caroline's disappearance, and eventually is a house. And it's also, of course, a vast supernatural occurrence. But of course, this happens, and it's only then, when this big light show happens and occurs, that the neighbours actually come out of their door to actually show some interest in actually what's going on. It's not that the neighbours are selfish; they just don't care. Okay. The idea being is they become another. They become part of this idea of once they lose the house, once they lose the space, once they lose the environment, there's nothing there for them to rebuild. They become othered by not having the same space and place and environment of that. So, of course, as this idea being this metaphor for the American dream and the loss of the American dream as well, and this idea that Kellner notes creates this 1980s environment where there's an atmosphere of fear and trembling within the age of Reagan. The idea that consumerism becomes rampant, the idea that you want to buy everything, but of course there's the potential that you lose everything as well. Finally, the Poltergeist films themselves cannot be measured by its initial box office takings, as the film has proven to be a landmark of popular culture. An iconic status has been allowed for instantly recognisable homage and pastiches throughout its history, with films such as Scary Movie 2, Paranorman, and of course South Park, Family Guy, American Dad, and The Simpsons. And I've gone through this entire place and not mentioned that awful clown that will haunt your dreams. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that overview and deep dive into Poltergeist and also the afterlives and legacy of Poltergeist as well. We've been galloping through these talks, and we're now at our kind of penultimate speaker, who's going to be talking to us about the teen supernatural thriller or horror, The Craft. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr Miranda Corcoran, who is a lecturer in 21st century literature at University College Cork. She is an author of Witchcraft and Adolescence in American Popular Culture, published by the University of Wales Press. She's also currently chair of the Irish Association for American Studies and co-editor of the journal Shirley Jackson Studies. So when you're ready, Miranda, I'm very pleased to hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, let me just click on slideshow and we should be good to go. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so in my presentation, I'm going to discuss the treatment of space, particularly spaces of girlhood, in Andrew Fleming's 1996 film, The Craft. As a horror film, The Craft is somewhat unusual, especially in comparison to some of the other texts we've explored this evening, in that the affect it most commonly produces is not one of fear or disgust. Instead, for many viewers, the film's portrayal of powerful teen witches is inspiring, even aspirational. Similarly, the presentation of space in The Craft differs from the way many horror films foreground threatening or uncanny spaces. Rather, in The Craft, liminal spaces frequently function as sites of liberation and transformation. Gina Whisker observes that images of liminal spaces are common to the Gothic. They tend to be doorsteps or windows through which you do not invite in the ghost or vampire, and the liminal spaces of existence, hovering between being and unbeing, dead and undead. Liminal spaces are betwixt and between, interstitial zones where the rules that govern everyday life are temporarily suspended. It is for this reason, Whisker notes, that liminal spaces can be liberating, sites of subversion and dissent. These liminal spaces and the interruptions in calm often threaten complacency in authorized views or orthodoxies are figured as interstices, underneath, above, around the side of, parallel to, or in the fissures in established places and being. By identifying the potential for disruption at the heart of the liminal, Whisker is working within a schema marked out by the originators of the concept, Arnold van Gennep and Victor Turner. For both theorists, liminality describes the spatial or symbolic transition from one clearly defined social position to another. For example, marriage, death, and funereal rites, rituals of initiation, and rites of passage. In the movement between established positions, previously fixed categories, such as those of identity, as well as divisions of time and space, become ambiguous. In his later writings, Turner stressed the transformative potentials of the liminal period, one in which the social conventions and hierarchies are shed. During these rites of passage, then, persons can try on new ways of being, even if only temporarily. And this kind of liminality, the experience of being betwixt and between, is at the heart of the craft. The film centers on 4 adolescent girls, puberty, of course, being a liminal stage, who begin practicing witchcraft largely as a means of resisting the structural inequalities that have rendered them socially marginal. So I'm not going to do an overview of the plot because I feel like anyone who was a teenage girl or a teenage girl adjacent in the 90s or 2000s has probably seen this, but each of the 4 girls inhabits an identity that could be understood as subjugated within the context of late 20th century neoliberal capitalism. Rochelle is the only Black student at an exclusive private school. Bonnie is ostracized by her peers for the scars that disfigure much of her body. Working class Nancy struggles with a violent home life, and new girl Sarah is battling mental illness. When the girls practice the witchcraft that unites them as a coven and grants them the power to change their material circumstances, they often do so in remote natural spaces, beaches and forests, for instance, and this echoes in many ways the early modern construction of the witches' Sabbath. However, many of the film's key scenes take place in liminal settings. Shifting away from the horror convention of liminal spaces as inherently uncanny, the liminal sites imbued with occult power in the craft are often mundane, marginal, or transitional spaces associated with adolescent girlhood. The witches consolidate their coven in a school corridor, express their separation from normative middle-class values in the backseat of a bus, and come into their powers in classrooms where adult authority appears entirely impotent. In their work on girlhood and space, BAFTSS and Adams argue that within an educational setting, hallways, bathrooms, lunchrooms, and even classrooms at times, all of which have utilitarian purposes, can become kid spaces in which they exert their power, at least temporarily. They maintain that such sites are liminal spaces because they are essentially transitory, with the power dynamics at play shifting as teens move from classroom to cafeteria to locker room to corridor. While some scholars note that such liminal zones might be dangerous, particularly for young people who are already marginalized, after all, shifting governance and the suspension of rules opens up space for bullying and harassment, as we see in the craft, BAFTSS and Adams nevertheless maintain that these liminal spaces offer room in which to move and become somebody of your own making. In the craft, liminal and marginal sites, schoolyards, abandoned corners of city parks, childhood bedrooms are remade as magical circles and ritual altars, even as the witches employ glamours or spells to change their hair and eye colors, assuming, at least temporarily, new identities. And I would argue that the witches' transformation of mundane adolescent spaces into temporarily enchanted realms can be read as an explicitly supernatural expression of scholar Mary Celeste Kearney's claim that girls' bedrooms are frequently sites of cultural production as opposed to simply passive consumption. Thus, the suspension of regulations and the dissolution of identity that takes place in these liminal zones creates an almost carnivalesque interstitiality where the witches can transform their bodies and identities, trying out new modes of being and slipping free of the rigid categories which had previously constrained them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Our speakers have done an amazing job of providing rich presentations, but more or less keeping to time as well, which is like unheard of in an academic event. So thank you very much. I'm now going to be speaking. I'm going to be the last speaker of our lineup, so audience members can begin thinking about any questions they might want to put into the chat. I'm going to share my screen and try and transition from speaker to presenter, and I'm probably not going to do this very smoothly, so just bear with me. 1 second. Yes, share. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. And if I press from the beginning, there we are. So we've covered kind of occult spaces in films like The Wicker Man and kind of the suburban nightmares of films like Poltergeist and It. I'll be shifting to a film that's slightly less obvious. It's the film The Vanishing, released in 1988, or Spoelloos in its Dutch title. And it's a thriller that doesn't necessarily seem like a horror at first glance. It wasn't received as a horror film when it first came out. But over time, The Vanishing has been reclaimed as part of this tradition of European horror cinema, what the critic Kevin Winter calls continental horror. And Kevin Winter sees this style of horror cinema as kind of challenging and departing from the narrative and thematic norms of American or British horror. And The Vanishing fits into this category of continental horror, especially in its representation of space. Winter describes this kind of genre or mode of continental horror being about the unpredictable violence or violent contingencies of the modern world, where individuals can easily disappear in populated places, where things can be hid or concealed beneath the anonymous landscapes of cities, and also where threats are increasingly mobile in a globalized world as well and can move across borders. I am going to give a brief synopsis so that those of you who haven't seen The Vanishing, you know what happens in it, and I'll include a couple of spoilers as well. It's about a young couple, a young Dutch couple, Rex and Saskia, who are on a road trip in rural France. And they pull up at a gas or a service station, and Saskia goes in to buy some drinks and she just disappears, she vanishes. And many years after Saskia's disappearance, Rex is still really haunted and obsessed by what happened to Saskia. And the audience are introduced to Raymond, who on the surface is a very normal family man living in France. But he has a dark side to him, and he knows what happened to Saskia, and he's willing to tell Rex on one condition. He approaches Rex with an offer, and that is that he will tell him or show him what happened to Saskia on the condition that he experiences exactly what she did. And driven by desperation, Rex agrees. They take this very odd kind of road trip back from the Netherlands, back into France, back into the site of Saskia's disappearance. And Raymond then drugs Rex. And in the closing scenes of the film, Rex wakes up underground, buried alive in a coffin. And that's part of the reason why Winter sees it as a continental horror. He identifies a very bleak, negative curiosity in these films. And Rex and Saskia's fates remain unknown. There's no kind of rescue or justice or catharsis at the end of the film. But what also makes The Vanishing so unsettling is how it really weaponizes very mundane, ordinary settings. The film is set across some very physically transitory settings, like the gas or the service station, the freeway, the border between France and the Netherlands. And these places are all defined by movement and by busyness, yet they remain strangely empty. In the film The Vanishing, the place kind of has a very peculiar, odd kind of meaning. And it's this kind of emptiness that the scholar Hazel Andrews draws on and identifies, and she draws on the concept of the non-place to describe these locations in the film. Now, a non-place is a distinctly modern environment marked by anonymity and indifference, like the airport lounge or the motorway or freeway. And these are spaces kind of stripped away of any memory, any history, any personal identity. And they sort of lack the rootedness that comes from community use over time. And in The Vanishing, these non-places in the film kind of mirror the existential feeling and limbo that Rex endures when he's searching for Saskia. So the gas station where Saskia disappears is kind of a very fitting backdrop that alludes to themes of disorientation and loss. And when Rex and Saskia first arrive, there's kind of a casual hum of movement. There's travellers chatting, there's cars driving by. And yet when Saskia disappears, that same bustle of the station, at first harmless, kind of shifts into something far more unnerving, a place where disappearances can happen. And the camera really trails Rex searching for Saskia. He searches every corner of this kind of still bright, this still breezy station. And what was once mundane kind of becomes like a maze. It's sort of a disorientating space. Rex keeps glimpsing women who resemble Saskia, each time with mounting disappointment. And throughout the film, Rex is shown in these anonymous, very transient spaces, like the gas station and forecourt where Saskia disappeared, the journey back across the border. But there's a kind of ironic and single scene that interrupts this this flow of kind of faceless places. And during their grim road trip together, Rex and Raymond, for no apparent reason, stop off at a well-known site off the French freeway. And this is a memorial. It's called the Memorial for the Future. And it commemorates one of France's deadliest road accidents. It was a mass casualty crash involving multiple vehicles. And this is kind of almost a poignant moment laced with irony. It contrasts a very public tragedy, officially commemorated with a memorial with stone, with Saskia's very private tragedy that's unacknowledged and unresolved. And the memorial kind of highlights the cruelty of her fate and contrasts very painfully with the series of indifferent spaces that really define the rest of the film. So it's sort of a scene which acts as kind of a subtle twist of the knife, and contrasts to Saskia's fate, where there's no body, no grave, no closure at all. And this kind of contrast of non-place and commemoration is really kind of pivotal to some of the horror in The Vanishing. And the horror emerges not from the supernatural as such, but from what Kevin Winter describes as the unpredictable violence of the modern world. It emphasises again and again anonymous spaces, mobility, and that sense of dislocation. So the film's settings overall kind of strip away kind of memory, identity, and security, and highlight how individuals like Rex, like Saskia, are profoundly vulnerable. And they're settings where disappearances are both possible and also kind of terrifyingly unremarkable as well. So it sort of refuses a traditional cliched architecture of horror, and instead The Vanishing situates fear within the mundane, and uses place and space to really meditate on loss, on memory, and ultimately kind of sometimes the indifference of an increasingly globalized world. So I'm going to finish there, and then this is all the presentations. I'm the final speaker for tonight. We have just about half an hour, just under half an hour, to maybe touch on and answer any questions you might have. So I'll just stop sharing my screen. And I think I may see if all the speakers can maybe turn their camera on. And let's see if we have anything that has been popped into the chat whilst we've been speaking. I think there's a question for Steve. Yep. Okay, so I'll read out the question. So question for Steve. You touched on how The Wicker Man doesn't necessarily feel like horror until the final sequence. Do you feel this ambiguity is something that underlies folk horror, or does it simply align the film with others? Isn't it a horror films?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know that Robin Hardy and Anthony Schaffer set out to make a horror movie. I don't know. They were notoriously vague when interviewed about these kinds of questions, so we just don't know what was in their minds. It does seem that Robin Hardy was afraid of modern day pagans, from what we can tell. So he thought this might be a real life kind of scenario that could happen. But I think that in the context of the movie, my sense is that the way they put it together, and Schaffer was the writer, and of course he had written mysteries before, and so he kind of builds it as a mystery. And my sense of it is that even today, the latest review of the book I've seen, which there haven't been too many, but the latest review made that point, saying that this is not really horror, and even questioned whether or not it belonged in the series Devil's Advocates, because it wasn't horror. I think that it is horror, and I think it was probably the genre is one of those things I struggle a lot with, because I watch a lot of movies that are not called horror. They may be called thrillers, they may be called something else, that come into the horror realm. I think this is one of those that really kind of walks that borderline, and it really is hard to say without a writer or director coming out and saying explicitly, I intend this to be a horror movie. But I think that it participates enough in it that it becomes horror. And folk horror in general is kind of a way of trying to understand certain films that have categories in common or sort of traits in common. And The Wicker Man, of course, is one of the foundational 3 movies that fit into that category. So by default, it sort of fits.
Yeah, thank you for that detailed answer, Steve. Then definitely understand the categories and the genre labels that can be more restrictive than helpful. We've got a few more questions in the chat. We've got a couple for Kev. What I'll do is I'll run through the first question for you, Kev, and then see if any others have come in. And if not, we can return to the second one. So question for Kev. you've mentioned the concept of space as an antagonistic device, but I was wondering if in your work you've come across any work which looks at space as antagonist, like a character written as a non-human antagonist. I'm thinking maybe more literary examples like the spaces of the Overlook Hotel or the moving corridors or impossible outdoor spaces of something like House of Leaves. Thank you for that thoughtful question. Kev, do you have any thoughts or responses to that?
Possibly in the way that spaces are receptacles for people's expectations. So the two examples I gave of Sightseers and Eden Lake. So the spaces, as we've said, they're antagonistic devices, but they're also kind of spaces in which these, basically, they're spaces that have expectations put upon them. So in that way, there's almost a little bit of a pathetic fallacy. So you kind of generate a little bit of sympathy for the space itself. So it's not just a kind of passive backdrop, it's a space in which you have your own expectations. So to see people place unrealistic expectations onto the space kind of imbues space itself with a bit of character.
Nice, thank you, Kev. We've got a couple more questions coming in. So we've got one for everyone, but we also have one for Mark and Marcus, which I think I'll ask first and then go back to the one from Vincent. So assuming you know Mark and Marcus, the stage adaptation of The Woman in Black, do you think the horror of the landscape translates into the theatre space? And what effect does the transformation of these vast spaces into a chamber piece have on the horror of space? And that's from Catherine. Marcus, do you want to speak to that or say anything in response to that?
Yeah, if I can respond to that. Yeah, well, it's a really good question, actually. And funny enough, actually, the first iteration of The Woman in Black was when I saw it, Stephen Mallatrat's adaptation, which famously is only 2 or 3 actors, with the female character roaming around, these spaces. So she kind of breaks that fourth wall. So yeah, I think in terms of it does suggest how this is kind of a liminal text itself in terms of the different iterations. So it's a radio play, it's a stage play, it's a cinematic film, it's a televisual film, and of course the original novella is very evocative of both landscape and sound, which is something that's particularly evoked in Nigel Neal's adaptation. So the question of spaces for me anyway, the question of spaces in the stage play is more about how the interior of the theatre is used, I think, and I still think it's evocative in using the actorly performance and the script again to kind of try to create these landscapes. But I think it maybe is again even more intimate in terms of thinking about a story that's being told in a building, a bit like placing you within Ilmarsh House, possibly. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it's a really, really good question.
And I have not actually ever seen the stage production, so I'm at a disadvantage there.
Thank you for that detailed response, Mark and Marcus. It's interesting to think about the different formats and venues. We have a question that's for everyone, so I guess any of our speakers can chip in. What do speakers think about threats or disruptions to the cinema frame itself? So films like Dr. Sleep, It Chapter 2 feature sudden 90-degree tilts of frame. Wolf Creek uses saturated filters to overwhelm the frame with light. You probably know other examples. What do you think of instances like these? So this is open to anyone. So if any of our speakers want to chip in with a response, please do.
Can I just a quick one about that, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
Did anybody watch Doctor Who last week? We had exactly the same thing where this idea of breaking the fourth wall occurred. And it's quite a peculiar circumstance when you do that. And I think it happened, I think the first time I ever saw this was in Gremlins 2. Well, they stopped the film. And then Hulk Hogan comes on and moans at the fact that the Gremlins have broken the movie. And I think it's this idea that you become participants of the film. The film isn't passive. There's this idea that I know Deadpool does and things as well, but this idea that you have this notion that the film itself isn't just a film that's passively there. The idea is you create this notion that the audience is part of the film by having this other level, as it were. So I think it's quite somewhat disturbing occasionally. And again, I think even somebody mentioned The Ring, this idea you have a screen and the thing comes, so it comes out the screen at people, this idea that things are not passive and you sit there eating your popcorn or your whatever it could be, and then something happens that then, I think that's quite an effect. It doesn't have to be used all the time, but I think it's quite an effective use of the space and the environment that we have. With this space that we've got here works as an interesting thing when we stop and we address the potential participants of the movie in some way. So I think it shouldn't be overused, but I think it's quite an interesting idea to break the space that we're in some ways.
Yeah, if we could follow that up just really quickly with a kind of a breaking the fourth wall, but movies like The Tingler and others that used, especially William Castle movies, that used gimmicks to make the audience feel they were part of the horror film, I think led into this rather bold move of breaking the fourth wall and then making you, as Robert said, be part of the film. That's I think the main goal of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really rich question, especially in the context of horror, where destabilizing the audience is often the goal. I often interpret the cinematic frame as a kind of a psychological boundary, and where it can show some of the character's mental state. And I think like films like Hereditary, where the camera moves really unnaturally or flips perspectives and echoes the character's sort of descent and mental growth or loss. I think we have another question. I think going back to Kev, you've mentioned, Kev, in your presentation, Dawn of the Dead and The Shining, both set in or based on real concrete locations, spaces. You talked about this in regards to oppressive spatial tension. And I wondered if you had discovered any work during your research that examines any oppressive spaces that are made by design. So spaces that are constructed deliberately as anxiety-inducing or oppressive in terms of set design. So that's a very detailed question, Kev. I wonder if you have anything in response to that.
I think I'd probably echo what you said about non-places, Christina. So two of the films that I examined were Creep and Deathline. And obviously the underground I'd consider it to be a non-place. It kind of discourages expressions of identity. So I don't know if it's designed to be oppressive as such, but it's certainly designed to repress identity. So there's quite a lot of horror associated with a loss of identity. So when you enter these spaces, as is the case with other non-places, you sort of put your expressions on hiatus. And because we spend more and more time within these spaces, we spend more and more time repressing our own identities. And there's obviously a danger that we become non-people the more we spend time in non-places. So whilst I wouldn't say they were designed to be oppressive places, they in fact are oppressive places. Maybe not by design, but by practice.
Yeah, certainly it's interesting, the idea of a space that isn't intended to be oppressive, but does become, just by how through its architecture or design, it becomes very claustrophobic and unsettling. And certainly The Vanishing has that, but also there are other films. I think someone's mentioned Funny Games by the Austrian director Michael Haneke. Certainly of that from that group or genre of continental horror I spoke about, that is certainly recognizable. We have, I think someone's mentioned Underground in Deathline and Creep feature really great gothic subterranean spaces. Someone's thanking Kev for the really detailed answers. I mean, I have a question about, I guess it's about nationality and space, and it's sort of a theme and question that has partially been covered. We've talked a lot about British and American horrors in the presentations tonight. And I wonder if any of the speakers could talk about kind of notable differences in how space and place sort of function in British cinema and horror and American horror. Kind of, are there obvious differences across kind of the Atlantic there in terms of space and place in British and American horror?
Again, do you mind if I jump into that one?
Oh, absolutely, go ahead, Rob.
I think I see it obviously through looking and researching at Poltergeist, that these are spaces that haven't got any history. I think Kev mentioned this idea of non-space and non-places, this idea of a repetition of a housing estate. They become a no place, they become a place of nothing. Whereas we have this notion, it covers maybe in the UK more than anything else, this kind of deep sense of history. So this idea of being the Wicker Man, for example, and the Woman in Black, all have this context that this is an established space. It's a space that has existed for a long time. There's an interesting TV series like drama called The Stone Tapes, which again has this idea of it being things that are dark and have hidden, have been buried, have been repressed and pushed away. But there's a notion that there's history to it. We go to America, and of course we have indigenous people in America with their history and their contexts. But of course, this idea of having America being a relatively new country, there isn't enough time to establish mythology, to establish history, and to establish this notion of a long past where things could be hidden. It's very quick, covered quickly to build something else new, to do another car park, to do another building, another housing site. So it then becomes this notion that the horror becomes identikit spaces and being lost in this no space compared to lost in the history of maybe the English or British spaces that we've had for a long time.
Can I pop in as well, actually, on the end of that? Because actually, yeah, I think that difference is very pronounced between UK and US horror. But the other thing I noticed with US horror is the regional variation is so pronounced. So if you look at something like The Witch, set in 17th century New England, and the spatial horror in that film emerges from like the threat of the wilderness and these Puritan notions of, arriving in the new world, and kind of planning, or the ideal is to, establish a new Jerusalem, Christ's kingdom on a new continent, and then being confronted by like the depths of the unknown forest, and it's dark and it's oppressive, and you don't know what's moving between the trees. But then if you move to like Southern examples of horror, if you move to something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, kind of you get so many images of like decay and rust and dereliction. And then, you've got horror movies set on like the open highways of the West, things like The Hitcher. So I think one thing that's really fascinating about the US is the way in which regional variation and regional differences very much impact the kind of horror that is explored within a particular text and the specific histories of distinct regions. Even if you look at something like The Hills Have Eyes, which is all about like nuclear testing in the American Southwest, like I think it's fascinating how those histories and those different kind of topographies impact how horror is constructed across American cinema, because you do have that vast geographical variation as well.
Yeah, thank you for those detailed responses. I certainly echo what you're saying about American horror being fascinated with the idea of vast, unknowable spaces and the frontier, whilst British horror was kind of being more concerned, or more obviously concerned, with history and like kind of bleeding of the past into the present. And I think there's been a comment that echoes some of what Miranda's saying as well. Bone Tomahawk is interesting in terms of indigenous American spaces and the perversion within them, and that white colonialism cannot tame and only destroy. So I think that's an interesting and really important point to make about kind of the regional horror within regional horrors within kind of broader American horror. Scrolling back up, we had an interesting question. So a question for everyone, away from questions of specific location and setting. Does anyone have any thoughts on horror's use of dead space, either in the films you've discussed tonight or elsewhere in the genre? I'm always creeped out by dark corners and things we don't see, clever use of framing, eerie empty space, etc. It Follows, for example, is a very effective here, and the lighting, cinematography, emphasizing isolated spaces of Detroit. Is there anyone who wants to speak to that and kind of talk about that, the kind of dead spaces in horror?
Just very briefly, if no one else wants to jump in, the first thing I thought about when I read that question was the film Skinamarink, which is very controversial because I know lots of people love it and were terrified, and lots of people absolutely hated it and thought it was like pretentious garbage that just, pointed a camera at walls for an hour and a half. But I was definitely in the camp of people who was absolutely terrified by that film, and I don't get frightened by horror movies very often. I think like a lot of people here, when you work with them, you become kind of inured to it. But there was something about the empty, the dead space, and the way in which the grainy film stock, well, it was filmed on digital camera, I think, and then it was kind of, they upped the graininess to make it look more like the 90s or something. But the way in which those empty spaces with the grainy camera footage made it look as if shapes were kind of coalescing and forming, even if there was nothing there. So you're kind of on alert throughout the entire film to see something horrible materialize. So like I find things like that very effective. And I think there is something about, like, there's almost an abjection to that kind of space because it becomes kind of borderless. You can't quite see what's there. The boundaries between different objects and images kind of break down. So I think it's something that's quite effective in text like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to jump in and say my favorite example is Alien, which of course puts you in the ultimate blank space or dead space of outer space. So much so that I recently watched 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is rated G. Okay, this is really pretty amazing, and the outer space scenes can be quite scary because of that lack of context. This simple dead space everywhere, all around you. I think it really kind of gets at something very psychological.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two really good examples that contrast with each other with Alien and Skinamarink. And certainly in Skinamarink, the idea, like, I liked how nostalgia itself almost became a haunted space, the kind of like really grainy VHS aesthetics and the low resolution, really ambient noise, like, and how nostalgia became something physical but really not comforting. So I really found that kind of how it overturned that feeling, that really interesting in that film. We have another question. Again from Miranda, I think maybe specific to the craft. So I was chasing a thought around in my head about Nancy, the goth queen in the craft, and how she is transplanted from one space, the trailer, to another, the penthouse, and how that really impacts her character. I don't think I have a proper question, but wondered if Miranda just had any general thoughts about that aspect of the film and the craft.
Yeah, like I think that kind of how she moves in space, or how she's transplanted from the trailer to the penthouse, is really interesting in many ways because of how those spaces are filmed and because of the set design and how they're constructed. So the trailer is such an oppressive space. Like, it's really small. There's barely enough room for the three people who live there. It's cramped. It leaks when it's raining, which kind of fits in with this kind of theme of rain that you get early in the film, which is quite oppressive. But it's, the film is set in Los Angeles, and you get this really interesting few, opening sections where instead of the bright kind of sunny Los Angeles we've sort of come to expect from cinema, we instead get like this torrential downpour. So the original space that she's in, it's cramped and it's, it's leaking and it's flooding. And then she's transplanted once she, basically kills her mother's partner and gets the life insurance. She's transplanted to this very glamorous penthouse, which is exactly the opposite in terms of being very, very open. It's all windows. So it's like the inverse of that trailer. And I think, like, if you're thinking about the films in terms of like how they align the characters, or how they incorporate the four elements of like earth, air, fire, and water, there's initially that kind of association with water, which is something that's quite oppressive. And then as she comes into this wealth, that, like, good on you, girl, kill your abusive stepfather. When she comes into this wealth, she's kind of positioned in this high, open, airy space. So like, I find that particularly fascinating. I'm not sure if it so much impacts her character as it is a reflection of her character's kind of transition as she kind of increasingly seeks to further her own power. Because I think the thing about Nancy is that she's very sympathetic for much of the film. And even like throughout the film, like I kind of see where she's coming from a lot of the time, which probably says something about me, but like, her initial objectives are quite sympathetic. She's very poor. She has an abusive home life. She wants to escape that. She presumably is aware that as like a young working class woman, there's probably no way for her to escape the cycle of poverty in which she's caught, other than, the dark forces of witchcraft. But as the film progresses, she kind of moves from simply wanting to free herself from this, abusive environment, and to craving power more broadly, and just simply wanting power for the sake of it to become this incarnation of power. So I kind of wonder if that kind of movement higher up into the air above the city is sort of reflective of that kind of unbridled desire for power. So that was a bit of a long rant, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you for that really detailed answer as well, Miranda. We have about just under 10 minutes. We have still a few more questions coming in. So we have a question about prolonged static shots to create an uncomfortable claustrophobic environment. So someone's asking about Mikhail Haneke's Cachet, using it to great effect. Are there any other examples of that kind of claustrophobic shot where the viewer is essentially trapped? Does anyone have any responses to that, or any kind of obvious examples that may crop up there?
Yeah, just jump in. Obviously, you know, we're talking about a televisual text in the iteration of The Woman in Black, and again, Marcus will probably be able to elaborate more on director Herbert Wise, who was something of a master of the understated. And I think, you know, if you watch that film, you'll see one, you know, how it's been written with the dynamics of building up tension, also around the advertisement breaks. But also, you know, Wise as a director has the confidence to hold the camera still when he needs to kind of create that idea of a slow burn and create that idea of pregnant menace. So I think that's one of the things that very much marks this adaptation, is that it's something from another age, you know, when there is less kinesis or desire for kinesis in both camera and editing. So I'm not sure if that answers that question, but I think it does raise, you know, some interesting thoughts about, you know, what we were talking about in the book.
And thinking of Herbert Wise, of course, apart from The Woman in Black, his other most acclaimed production is obviously I, Claudius, made in with very different methods. Woman in Black on film, I, Claudius in an electronic studio on videotape. But you can still see it's the same director because of his wonderful stillness, and again building up a great deal of menace, perhaps most famously with just a very, very the camera starts to move very, very slowly as the Emperor Augustus is starting to get extremely angry with the huge number of men who have slept with his daughter. It's one of the most famous scenes in I, Claudius. So again, I don't know if that answers the question, but it's something. It is a product of Herbert Wise, and perhaps a not more leisurely, but more patient style of production.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts, Mark and Marcus. We have only a few minutes left. It's gone by very quickly, and I need to leave a couple of minutes just for Laura and Shelley to wrap up. We have just one brief question about space as a resource, really, about how characters kind of can use space kind of in the reverse of a threat. So space being a resource as opposed to a threat for a protagonist. Do the panel have any thoughts about this? I mean, the most obvious example for me is that Wes Craven film, The People Under the Stairs, kind of where that labyrinthine kind of space becomes kind of a weapon, and the, I guess, victims, you could call them, use the physical layout of that space to outsmart captors. And that's a kind of analogy for all sorts of things around capitalism, housing, etc. That's a really interesting question, which kind of overturns some of kind of the cliches about horror and space. Just before I hand over to Laura and Sheely, does anyone have any final thoughts, or from our speakers, anything they'd like to add or say before we begin to wrap up today's really interesting discussion?
If I could just follow up on what you were saying there, Christina, about the space. It's interesting because going back to the question about American and British horror, in America, a lot of times space can be a positive element in horror because you have a place to run. There's always somewhere you can escape to. And I think that occurs in so many movies. I couldn't even start to list how space can advocate for you in horror.
A good example is The Devil Rides Out, directed by Terence Fisher, with the safe space within the circle.
Yeah, we've got a few good examples there, kind of a really rich set of films that we can draw upon. Thank you very much to everyone who's engaged tonight, and for that really interesting discussion. Thanks so much to our speakers. I am going to hand over just back to Laura and Shelley to close the event and to hopefully plug anything else in the calendar of the next few months. So Laura, Shelley, if you're there, I'll hand back over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you to all the fantastic panelists this evening. And thank you to everybody in the chat for some really interesting questions and really good discussion. So yeah, Shelley has dropped the link to the next event, which is at the end of May. It's on a Tuesday night this time, which is unusual for us. I think Tuesday the 27th, which is on Irish Horror Cinema. And there's all details in the chat and the registration link, which is open now, so you can go and register if you enjoyed this and want to see more from us. Shelley has also dropped information about our website, and you can sign up to our mailing list and so on to hear what else we're doing, and follow us on socials. So yeah, thanks very much again to everybody for coming along. Thank you, Christina, and to everybody else on the panel for a really interesting discussion, and see you all again. Thanks.